Now let's talk about an institution in trouble, the U.S. Central Bank, better known as the Federal Reserve. U.S. lawmakers are raising some tough questions. Is the Fed responsible for the banking crisis? Did it mishandle the situation? Did it fail to do its job? The questions are growing louder, especially after yesterday's announcement. The Federal Reserve has decided to hike interest rates again.
At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by a quarter percentage point. The process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go and is likely to be bumpy.
The banks will be fine. Let's focus on fighting the inflation. That's the message from the U.S. Fed. Its aggressive rate hikes have created a perfect storm. It led to the collapse of two American banks, and that in turn has caused turmoil in global financial stocks. Yesterday, the U.S. Fed had an opportunity to course correct, to restore the faith of depositors and investors in American banks. But the Fed chose to hike rates again. It says inflation is stubborn and must be dealt with first. So is America's central bank ignoring the larger crisis? The Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, offered a weak defense. For the failed banks, he blamed their managers. He said they are the ones who, quote-unquote, failed badly, and that the rest of the banking system was strong. He also downplayed worries about the financial system. So bank managers must take the blame, but what about the role of the Federal Reserve itself? Powell says a review is underway, an internal review.
We're undertaking a thorough internal review that will identify where we can strengthen supervision and regulation.
For some lawmakers, that explanation is not good enough. They want a probe against the U.S. Federal Reserve. Last week, a lawmaker asked Powell to step aside until a review into the bank failures was complete.
For this review to have any credibility at all, Chair Powell has to recuse himself. He is the one who not only presided over the Fed, that's the only way we can have some confidence in it.
That's Elizabeth Warren. She's a Democrat and perhaps the most vocal critic of the Fed in this crisis. She has now pushed a bill. It calls for more oversight. Warren has teamed up with the Republican for this bill. His name is Rick Scott. And what does the bill say? Right now, the U.S. Fed has an internal watchdog, the Internal Inspector General. It is responsible for oversight. It reports directly to the Federal Reserve Board. Now, if passed, the bill would replace this mechanism. The central bank will get an external watchdog, one that is appointed by the U.S. president. The fate of the bill is yet to be decided, but the scrutiny against the Fed will only intensify. Hearings are being planned in the U.S. Congress. Both the U.S. Senate and the House plan to look into the bank collapse. The hearings will begin next week. Remember, the collapse of two American banks came as a shock to the world. But was America's central bank also caught by surprise? Did they not see this coming? After all, this is the institution responsible for keeping an eye on banks. Powell says he was baffled by the collapse of the SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank, the first bank to fall in this crisis. Consider what he said, and I'm quoting, "The question we were all asking ourselves over that first weekend was, how did this happen? We are doing the review of supervision and regulation. My only interest is that we identify what went wrong here." And let me remind you, this is the chair of America's central bank talking. Clearly, he too was stumped by the collapse. But was the U.S. Fed completely clueless? The answer is no. Fed officials were aware of the risks. They met earlier this year for 2 days, 31st of January and the 1st Feb. And what did they discuss? Vulnerabilities to financial stability. Concerns were expressed. Some officials discussed specific possibilities. These included runs on non-banking financial institutions and the impact of large unrealized losses in banks. So Fed officials were definitely in the know. And was the Fed chair part of this meeting? Reports say he did register his presence. Was he briefed about the vulnerabilities? What was Powell's next move? What actions did he take? Did he try to prevent the collapse, or did he just ignore the problems? The chair of the U.S. Fed could face all of these questions once the hearings begin next week.